Nazis were socialists.
The facts that the Nazis were socialists.
Hitler was a socialist.
Hitler was left-wing in that he believed in socialism. Remember, Nazism is National Socialism.
Because whoever devised the spectrum once upon a time decided to put Hitler over here and Stalin over here. Instead, they're really the two forms of the same thing, both socialist. One is National Socialism and racism and, the racial violence of Hitler.
And so that's the big lie. The big lie is the idea that fascism is a phenomenon of the right. It's not.
Liar! Liar!
Right-wing talking heads and YouTube grifters love to make the claim that the Nazis were left-wing socialists. It's in the name, they say with the undeserved confidence of Zap Brannigan.
Welcome to my humble chamber, or as I call it, the Love-nasium. Sham pagan.
They cling to misinterpretations, incorrect definitions, and half-truths like Rose clung to the door at the end of Titanic, letting the truth sink to the icy depths like Jack's corpse.
I'll never let go. I promise.
Hi, I'm Ken McPhail, and this is... Do conservatives dream of urinal cakes? Hey, look everyone, it's my good pal Rusty. Say hi, buddy.
Hello, party people!
Buddy, these people aren't here to party, they're here to learn.
¿Por qué no las dos?
You got me there. Do you want to stick around and learn something as well?
Only if there's snacks.
Sorry, no snacks. How about a pop quiz?
Oh, man!
What did the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, the People's Republic of China, National Socialism, and urinal cakes have in common?
You shouldn't try to eat any of them.
While that may be true, buddy, that's not what I was going for.
Oh, I know. They're all misnomers.
Exactly. Every single one is misnamed, right down to the parties that control them. The Workers' Party of Korea, the Communist Party of China, and the National Socialist German Workers' Party all have names that insinuate a social and democratic government, but the actions, policies, and internal class structures of these parties are authoritarian and anti-democratic. So if everyone can agree that the DPRNK and the PRC aren't democratic republics despite their names, why can't conservatives apply the same logic to National Socialists? Well, it's in the name, as they say.
I thought you said you couldn't trust the name.
Correct, I did say that. Let me explain. Socialism is a big, scary word to capitalists and wage slaves that think they're capitalists.
I still don't get it.
Well, you didn't let me finish, did you? Now, where was I?
They think socialism is scary.
Right. Socialism is a threat to the ruling capitalist class, so they demonize it to keep the working class under control.
Like a bug's life?
That's a comparison that gets made pretty often.
Your Wi-Fi doesn't reach my tree, so I don't see a lot of online discourse.
Fair enough. Now, as I was saying, if they can attribute the atrocities of authoritarian fascism to the socialist system, then it adds some weight to their criticisms with people that don't usually look things up. People like Dinesh D'Souza, Dennis Prager, Senator Rand Paul, and right-wing Christian nationalist organizations like WallBuilders and PragerU take full advantage of this. In The Big Lie, Dinesh D'Souza, a man with a penchant for projection, confidently claims fascism and Nazism both emerged out of a debate within socialism. The problem began when the central prophecies of Marxism failed to occur. This created a massive crisis within the left, and essentially Marxism split into two camps. The first became Leninism and Bolshevism, and the other became fascism and Nazism. This, like the rest of his book, is a steaming pile of bullshit. Fascism emerged from nationalism, and Nazism emerged from fascism as a response to the social reforms coming from the left. Neither emerged from within socialism. Both fascists and Nazis rejected liberal democracy as obsolete, trying to find a new political system to deal with traditional concerns of civil order and hierarchy. These new nationalist philosophies drew their ideology of authority from the right while bastardizing the ideology of social reform from the left. They reviled democracy, but went about opposing it in different ways. Italy became a totalitarian dictatorship ruled by Benito Mussolini, and Germany became a totalitarian oligarchy ruled by competing personal empires with Hitler as the supreme arbiter. If this sounds like socialism to you, it's because you don't know what socialism is, and it's because of Christian nationalist organizations like the WallBuilders.
Wait, what's a Christian nationalist, and why would they want to lie to people?
Christian nationalists are exactly what they sound like. They are religious nationalists who promote Christian views in order to achieve control or standing in political, cultural, and social life. They want to lie to people because National Socialists were first and foremost nationalists.
What's a nationalist?
Someone who believes that the nation and the state should be congruent. WallBuilders claim in an article on their website that the Nazis were socialist in both name and deed. In order to support this claim, they began setting up a false narrative that anti-democracy and nationalization equals socialism, but it doesn't. Socialism is an inherently democratic endeavor. Anti-democracy is a totalitarian and dictatorial principle. In order to form this narrative, they state a false dichotomy. If the rights of private ownership were protected, then Nazism ought to be viewed as a form of capitalism. If, however, the Nazis dramatically infringed upon property rights to the extent that they failed to meaningfully exist, then their self-appointed moniker is rightly applied. By their own metrics, the Nazis were capitalist. But they do some serious mental gymnastics sprinkled with historical revision to make the Nazis fit their definition of socialism.
Wow, they sound insufferable. Why would they do gymnastics in their heads?
They're not literally doing gymnastics in their head, buddy. It's a turn of phrase, meaning they're connecting dots that aren't there to prove their point. They do this because of the first and more important word in the NSDAP, national, as in nationalism.
Oh!
They inaccurately define socialism as a society in which there is no real private ownership of the means of production, only state and government. A more accurate definition of socialism is an egalitarian economic and political theory encompassing diverse economic and social systems characterized by social ownership of the means of production. If the government owns the means of production and not the people, then it is not socialism. The article goes on to claim that socialism is the destruction of private property rights, assuming that most Americans will hear private property rights and think, gasp, the socialists want my toothbrush. But that's not what private property is, and I don't want anything that's been in your mouth.
So, what's private property mean if not my personal stuff?
Well, in socialism, there's a huge distinction between personal and private property. Private property refers to the means of production, factories, mines, apartment complexes, and the like. Personal property refers to consumer goods and goods produced by an individual.
So, I get to keep my treehouse and get free health care under socialism? Sounds like a good deal to me.
That's right, buddy. But landlords and health insurance company CEOs would be out of their cushy zero-labor jobs, and they pay the US government a lot of money to make sure that doesn't happen thanks to Citizens United. But that's a different video. The WallBuilders also claim in their article that Hitler believed that for Nazism to successfully come to power, they had to be extremely wary of being eaten away by the poison of Marxism, because according to them, the two ideologies are on the face so similar. They claim that from Hitler's perspective, Marxism differed from Nazism because the Nazis wouldn't let the international Jew use them for capitalist ends. In fact, they state, democratic elements were so repugnant to National Socialism that the state must release all leadership, but particularly the highest, that is, the political leadership, from its parliamentary principle of the majority rule. This sets up a false narrative that anti-democracy is synonymous with socialism, but it isn't. Socialism is an inherently democratic endeavor. Anti-democracy is a totalitarian, authoritarian, and dictatorial principle. They go on to claim that Nazism's repression of Marxists throughout the regime was actually because Hitler and his followers rejected Marxism on the belief that it was a clandestine method for achieving capitalism. Early NSDAP leaders like Gregor and Otto Strasser appealed to working class sentiments, hoping to wean German workers away from existing socialist and communist parties. However, the working class wasn't the party's intended base, as the early socialist rhetoric was later downplayed to attract the support of business leaders. The 25 points, the NSDAP's 1920 party program, denounced banks, department stores, and interest slavery, which suggests at least a semi-Marxian rejection of free market capitalism. However, these points have been used by anti-Semites since at least the medieval times, when Jews were restricted to occupations such as tax and rent collecting and money lending by a multitude of legal restrictions. Since Catholic doctrine of the time said that money lending for interest was a sin forbidden to Christians, it was one of the only occupations open to them. This was then used as proof that Jews were an insolent and greedy people that unfairly profited off of interest from typically Christian debtors, leading to many of the negative stereotypes and propaganda used against them today. In the 1930s, the NSDAP's main focus shifted to fully anti-Semitic and anti-Marxist propaganda. It wasn't until the economic crisis and widespread unemployment of the Great Depression that Germans were driven to Nazism. So if we look at the 25 points through a historical lens, we can see that the Nazis' overarching fundamental goal wasn't ending the private production of goods to establish a socialist utopia. It was safeguarding a social and racial hierarchy that put Nazis at the top, Jews on the bottom, and everyone else in the middle. They promised solidarity only to the members of the Volksgemeinschaft, or racial community, while denying rights to those outside of their so-called Aryan race. Austrian economist and Nobel laureate Friedrich von Hayek was appalled by economic planning like FDR's New Deal. He argued that any government intervention in the free market erodes freedom and leads to dictatorship. Von Hayek was extremely influential around the world within the conservative movement during the second half of the 20th century. He advised future terrible leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald fucking Reagan. His book, The Road to Serfdom, became a foundational text to the right. His assertions that all government interventions lead to totalitarianism are given new life in Dinesh D'Souza's book from earlier, The Big Lie, which reinforces the idea that the welfare state is a slippery slope to genocide. Wage slaves who think they're capitalists, free market purists, and conservatives everywhere eat this slop up while ignoring the real historical record.
Aren't they the ones that always say facts don't care about your feelings?
They most certainly are, buddy.
What a bunch of hypocrites.
You said it, pal. History shows that it was the parties that rose in reaction to the horrors the Nazis wrought that actually built the welfare states they bemoaned. Trying to denounce welfare programs as socialism and stating that helping the needy leads to genocide isn't just bonkers. It's historical and political sophistry that tries to label effect as cause and vice versa. They turn the victims into the villains for their own political gain. We know for a fact that the Nazis preserved private property while putting all the resources of their society into the service of a racist, expansionist national vision. They conquered, subjugated, and murdered millions of Jews, socialists, communists, homosexuals, black people, and disabled people. Trying to link that with universal health care or any other social welfare program is ridiculous. Senator Rand Paul claimed in his 2019 book, The Case Against Socialism, that Hitler was a socialist. He points to 3 specific pieces of evidence besides the misnamed National Socialism. His first piece of evidence are 2 points from the 25-point program, the NSDAP's political manifesto that was originally released in 1920 that he subsequently mistranslates. First, he quotes the 13th point as, "We demand the nationalization of all previous associated industries. The essence of socialism, state ownership of the means of production," which isn't the essence of socialism. Everything you see in the quote on your screen in parentheses are Rand Paul's words and are not in the original manifesto. In German, the 13th point is, "Wir fordern die Verstaatlichung aller Bische, Betriebs, vergesellschafteten Betriebe, Trusts." This translates to, "We demand the nationalization of all hitherto already socialized businesses, trusts." Notice that it says that they want to nationalize all socialized businesses, but Rand Paul's translation does not. He also quotes the 17th point, which seems to be the only socialist thing about the 25 points. "We demand a land reform suitable to our needs, provision of a law for the free expropriation of land for the purposes of public utility, abolition of taxes on land, and prevention of all speculation in land." In German, the 17th point is, "Wir fordern eine unseren nationalen Bedürfnissen angepasste Bodenreform. Schaffung eines Gesetzes zur unentgeltlichen Enteignung von Boden für gemeinnützige Zwecke, Abschaffung des Bodenzinses und Verhinderung jeder Bodenspekulation." Translation: We demand land reform tailored to our national needs. The enactment of a law allowing for the expropriation of land without compensation for public benefit purposes, the abolition of land rent, and the prevention of all forms of land speculation. However, Rand Paul fails to mention a document signed by Hitler in 1928 that explicitly adds an explanatory point. Anmerkung: Gegenüber den verlogenen Auslegungen des Punktes 17 des Programms der NSDAP von Seiten unserer Gegner ist folgende Feststellung notwendig. Da die NSDAP auf dem Boden des Privateigentum steht, ergibt sich von selbst, dass der Passus unentgeltlich Enteignung nur auf die Schaffung gesetzlicher Möglichkeiten bezogen hat, Boden der auf unrechtmäßiger Weise erworben werde oder nicht nach den Gesichtspunkten des Wohlwollens verwaltet wird, wenn nötig, zu enteignen. Das richtet sich demgemäß in erster Linie gegen der jüdische Grundstützspekulation Gesellschaften. Note: with regards to the dishonest interpretations of the 17th point of the NSDAP program from our opponents, the following statement is necessary. Because the NSDAP stands on the principles of private ownership, it falls into place that the passage free expropriation refers only to the creation of legal possibilities of expropriation, if necessary, of land illegally acquired or that is not managed in accordance with public welfare. Accordingly, this applies primarily to Jewish real estate speculation companies.
Wait, so the Nazis themselves said they stand on the principles of private ownership?
That's right, little dude. You see, when the Nazis talked about expropriation or seizing land, they were talking about taking land and property from Jews. They were very much in favor of private property for themselves. Not only that, but the fourth point specifically states that Jews can't be citizens. Staatsbürger kann nur sein, wer Volksgenosse ist. Volksgenosse kann nur sein, wer deutschen Blutes ist, ohne Rücksichtnahme auf Confession. Kein Jude kann daher Volksgenosse sein. Citizens can only be who is a national comrade. National comrades can only be who is of German blood, without consideration of religious affiliation. Therefore, no Jew can be a national comrade.
Wow, so these people just omit parts that don't agree with them.
Yep, pretty much. The second piece of evidence came from this conservative meme that shows a picture of Hitler next to a quote that is misattributed to him. The quote was actually from Gregor Strasser, and it was pointed out by Snopes around the time the meme was in heavy circulation with the right.
Let me guess, the right doesn't trust Snopes.
Nope, they think it's biased because it keeps debunking their claims.
Figures. So, who was Gregor Strasser? You mentioned him earlier, too.
Gregor Strasser was a nationalist anti-Semite who mixed some traditional left-wing economic ideas with his Nazi beliefs. However, by the late 1920s, Hitler had thoroughly rejected him and his ideas. He resigned from his positions of authority within the party in 1932 and was murdered by the Nazis during the Night of Long Knives in 1934 when Hitler called for the extrajudicial execution of hundreds of his political opponents. Strasser's reactionary and hateful views are regarded as heinous and contemptible by every flavor of socialist today. Rand Paul's third source was an article in The Independent by George Watson, who bases his claims almost entirely on things Hitler was alleged to have said to Otto Wagner. Wagner's remembrance of these conversations were published posthumously in 1978 in a book titled Hitler Up Close, Notes from a Confidant, 1929 to 1932.
Wait a minute. World War II ended in 1945, didn't it? So, this guy was only around for the beginning?
That's right, bud. Otto Wagner was removed from his position of authority in 1932, and then he was briefly detained during the Night of Long Knives, so he had plenty of reason to lie about Hitler. He wrote the text that became the book while a prisoner of war in 1946. In it, he reported that Hitler said he saw the whole National Socialism as based on Marx, which runs counter to everything we know about Hitler's hatred for, as he calls him, the Jew Karl Marx. It's like someone publishing a book in 2038 about Obama having based the American Care Act on Reagan's trickle-down economics. It's entirely asinine.
So, there's very flimsy evidence for the Nazis being socialist. What's the evidence that they weren't socialist?
Well, they imprisoned 81 elected members of parliament from the German Communist Party in concentration camps and arrested 26 out of 120 elected Social Democrats. Getting rid of their political opponents allowed the Nazis to pass the Enabling Act, giving Hitler total control of Germany. The other 94 Democratic Socialists voted against the act and faced immediate retaliation. Dozens were arrested and several fled into exile. Those who remained tried to appease the Nazi Party by distancing themselves from their brethren in exile, even voting in favor of Hitler's foreign policy statement in May of 1933. However, bootlicking never works for long. Over the course of the spring, their newspapers, property, and buildings were confiscated by the police. On June 21, 1933, Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick ordered the SPD closed down on the basis of the Reichstag fire decree and declared the party subversive and inimical to the state. all SPD deputies were stripped of their seats at the state and federal levels. Their meetings and publications were banned, and party members were blacklisted from public office and civil service. Not to mention the addendum to the 25 points that clearly states, because the NSDAP stands on the principles of private ownership. In an article for the Economic History Review, Germa Bell reported that although modern economic literature usually fails to notice it, the Nazi government in 1930s Germany implemented a large-scale privatization policy. The government sold public ownership in several state-owned firms in different sectors. The Nazi government used privatization as a tool to improve its relationship with big industrialists and to increase support among this group for its policies. Now, does that sound like socialism to you?
No, it doesn't. But if it's not socialism, then what is it?
The general consensus is that the Nazis were authoritarian state capitalists and fascists. They didn't redistribute land in accordance with socialist theory. They primarily stole land from Jewish individuals and organizations in a process known as Aryanization. They confiscated businesses, stores, homes, land, stocks, and cash assets and handed them over to Aryan individuals and companies. First, the Nazis encouraged Jewish businessmen to sell their businesses in Germany at extremely reduced prices from 1933 until the summer of 1938. In 1933, there were approximately 100,000 Jewish-owned businesses in Germany. But by 1938, nearly two-thirds of those businesses were either out of business or sold to non-Jews at a fraction of their actual value. The Nazis had terrorized, boycotted, and legislated the majority of Jewish business owners to their breaking points.
You humans can be so cruel.
Very much so. And we haven't even gotten to the worst parts. On November 10, 1938, Aryanization entered its second phase after the violent anti-Jewish riot known as Kristallnacht. This second phase was the forced transfer of all remaining Jewish-owned businesses to non-Jews. In the aftermath of the bloody Kristallnacht, the Nazis issued new regulations that prohibited all Jews from participating in most economic activities in the country. They appointed non-Jewish trustees to oversee the immediate forced sale of all Jewish businesses to non-Jews. The Nazis even made the original business owners pay the trustees' fee, which was slightly less than the sale price, making the already paltry sum given for these businesses even more pitiful. Some of the profits from these sales went to the Office of the Four-Year Plan, headed by Hermann Goering.
What was the 4-year plan?
That was a series of economic measures put in place by Hitler to provide funds for the rearmament of Germany and to prepare the country for self-sufficiency in 4 years, in disregard of the Treaty of Versailles.
So, where does the fascism come into play? And what is fascism anyway?
Well, buddy, fascism is a far-right, ultranationalist, populist political philosophy or movement that exalts the nation and often race above the individual, that is usually characterized by a centralized autocratic government led by a dictatorial leader. The ideas within fascism aren't new, despite the name coming from the 1920s. You see, Hitler and the Nazis didn't just pull the Nuremberg laws or Aryanization out of thin air. They studied American systems, adapted them to their needs, and scaled them up. The historical record is well documented on this. In 1933, Nazi lawyer Heinrich Krieger spent time studying American race law at the University of Arkansas. The research he did there became foundational for the Nuremberg laws. The Nazis praised American immigration law, particularly the Immigration Act of 1924, which established national origin quotas designed to preserve America's Nordic character and exclude racial undesirables. Roland Friesler, the infamous hanging judge, told the lawyers assembled at the June 5, 1934 meeting of the Commission on Criminal Law Reform, "This jurisprudence would suit us perfectly." When they finally sat down to draft the Nuremberg laws, they had German translations of American state laws spread across their desks. They examined the one-drop rule that defined anyone with 1 drop of black blood as black regardless of culture or appearance. The Nazi lawyers expressed some concerns over adopting a rule so harsh, thinking it would appear too radical. So they eventually settled on defining Jewishness as having 3 or 4 Jewish grandparents.
Wow! When people as cruel as the Nazis think an old American law is too harsh, that should really tell you something.
That it should, but it doesn't stop there. The Nazis didn't just borrow from our legal system, they also took from American sterilization programs.
Wait, America sterilized people? I thought you just did that to dogs and cats.
That's unfortunately correct. California, seen as a bastion of liberalism today, operated a forced sterilization program which operated from 1909 all the way until as recently as 1979, and sterilized over 20,000 people they deemed unfit. These unfit people were disproportionately black, Latina, indigenous, poor, and disabled women. By 1933, California had sterilized more people than all other US states combined. This became the model for the Nazis' eugenics program, and Nazi eugenicists even pointed to the program as proof that large-scale eugenics was possible. The Nazis took it to unheard-of extremes, sterilizing approximately 400,000 people under the 1933 law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. The Rockefeller Foundation funded German eugenics programs. Josef Mengele corresponded with Californian eugenicists, and Nordicism was a mainstream ideology taught at major universities. Madison Grant's 1916 book, The Passing of the Great Race, was so influential to Nazi ideology that Adolf Hitler wrote the author describing the book as his Bible.
Holy shit!
Before the Holocaust, there was the American genocide of indigenous peoples. 15,000 people were killed through exposure, disease, and starvation on what is now called the Trail of Tears because of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This forced removal of Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, and Chickasaw nations in the 1830s killed approximately 1/4 of those removed, and it wasn't an accident. It was a legislated ethnic cleansing. The U.S. cavalry slaughtered and mutilated between 150 and 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, mostly women, children, and the elderly, going so far as to take war trophies. The man who led the massacre, Colonel John Shivington, faced no legal consequences because the general post-Civil War amnesty at the time meant that no charges could be brought against him. In 1890, at least 250 Lakota men, women, and children were murdered at Wounded Knee. 20 soldiers received medals of honor for the massacre. The reservation system that the U.S. established in the late 1800s served not only as a blueprint for German concentration camps, but also for the Spanish reconcentration camps in Cuba, for which concentration camps get their name. And that's just what we did to the indigenous people. After the Civil War freed 4 million enslaved people, the southern states worked day and night to get them back legally. Though the 13th Amendment is lauded for abolishing slavery, it only did so with one critical exception: except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. This loophole allowed a new system of forced labor to flourish. Southern states passed the Black Codes, criminalizing vagrancy, unemployment, breaking curfew, loitering, and insulting gestures. These laws applied almost entirely to black people, and when black people were arrested, they were convicted by an all-white jury. Black people were forced into false confessions and subjected to systemic racial bias and violence that still happens to this day, despite the majority of white people wanting to pretend racism is a thing of the past. Then we come to convict leasing, a new type of slavery with a different name and a criminal justice coding to make it go down easier.
Chocolate coating makes it go down easier, but you have to wait 15 minutes for full potency, and you shouldn't go in swimming after for at least, what?
An hour.
The conditions of convict leasing were more often than not worse than plantation slavery. This was because convict laborers were rented temporarily. There was no incentive to keep convict laborers alive, as they didn't represent a capital investment like traditional slaves. Alabama and Louisiana had the highest mortality rates, frequently reaching 16 to 25% on an annual basis, due to brutal work in coal mines, railroads, and on sugar plantations, combined with negligence and abuse. This system generated enormous revenue for the state and corporations alike. Convict leasing funded state budgets across the South and rebuilt the infrastructure that was destroyed during the Civil War.
So, fascism is as American as hot dogs or an apple pie?
Yep. The fact is that Nazi Germany took a lot of lessons from the United States, and that's the real reason right-wing talking heads and grifters want to shift the blame to socialism. The racist ultranationalism of the United States, particularly the Jim Crow South, served as a blueprint for Nazism. If we admit that, then we have to admit that America hasn't always been great, that we've done horrible things, and that is anathema to nationalists. Thanks for watching and sticking around to the end. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel and lets me know that you want to see more of these video essays. We'll catch you in the next one. Say goodbye, Rusty.
Goodbye, Rusty.